Hello, my name is Jack, and this is my presentation on inflation and its economic benefits. A quick Google search would suggest that inflation is, quote, a general increase in prices and fall in the purchasing value of money, end quote. This definition, while concise, doesn't do the term much justice. According to Investopedia, inflation is, quote, a quantitative measure of the rate at which the average level of basket or selected goods and selected services in an economy increases over a period of time. It is the constant rise in the general level of prices where a unit of currency buys less than it did in prior periods. Often expressed as a percentage, inflation indicates a decrease in the purchasing power of a nation's currency. Okay, that definition got a lot wordier. In short, inflation is what happens when the government increases the quantity of money supplied in the economy. This can be done one of two ways, fiscally or monetarily. Allow me to explain. In every economics class, we are presented with two curves, the upward sloping curve representing supply and the downward sloping curve representing demand. Along the x-axis, we see quantity. Along the y-axis, we see price. This paradigm is the fundamental principle of economics because everything builds off of it. In macroeconomics, the study of the economy as a whole, we extend the usage of this paradigm to what is called the ASAD model. In this model, supply becomes aggregate supply, or AS, and the demand becomes aggregate demand, or AD. It's still the same concept. Demand goes down while supply goes up, but with a different twist. Price stays consistent, but quantity becomes GDP, since that's a way of measuring quantity on a grand scale. Aggregate supply refers to the total output of an economy, whereas aggregate demand refers to the total spending in an economy. Specifically, aggregate demand is made up of consumption spending, goods bought by households like food, appliances, etc., plus investments by firms, plus government spending, plus spending on exports, minus imports. This all happens inside our own economy. If we're referring to the United States, picture a box around the ASAD model labeled the American economy. As you can see, the application of the initial supply/demand curve can be extended. It's the foundation that everything in economics builds off of. But what about inflation? What about, as we mentioned earlier, fiscal policy versus monetary policy? Well, there are two ways that the government can influence the supply of money in an economy, through fiscal inflation or monetary inflation. Put simply, monetary inflation refers to the rate of money printing that occurs in the Federal Reserve. Fiscal inflation, on the other hand, refers to when the government influences the supply of money through spending or taxes. Think about it this way. When the Federal Reserve inflates the dollar, increases the supply of money in the economy by printing more money, the aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. That's monetary inflation. When the federal government inflates the dollar, increases the supply of money in the economy by spending more, the aggregate demand shifts to the right. In either of these scenarios, the point of intersection has changed between these two curves. Before we get any further, there are two more terms I must define: the boom and bust cycle and recession. The concept of the boom and bust cycle, originally theorized by Jean-Charles Léonard de Sismondi in his book Nouveau Principe d'économie politique, holds that the economy is in a state of perpetual expansion and contraction. The economy inflates and deflates. When it deflates, that's called a recession. The term recession is oftentimes referred to as a depression. However, these two terms are very different. While a depression is a very severe form of a recession, it is important to recognize the distinction between these two terms. According to Investopedia, quote, the U.S. has experienced 33 recessions since 1857, according to the NBER, varying in length from 6 months, January to July 1980, to 65, October 1873 to March 1879. The average contraction lasts 17.5 months, but since 1945, durations have shortened significantly, averaging 11.1 months. Maynard Keynes, a famous contributor to modern economics, believed inflation was an inherently good thing, marking a low point in unemployment. As we see in the Keynesian Phillips curve, we see a trade-off relationship between inflation and unemployment. Essentially, in the Keynesian view, a benefit of inflation could potentially be low unemployment and an economy that is working closer to its full potential, the highest supply and demand combo possible. However, the Phillips trade-off has been partially discredited by the existence of stagflation. Stagflation is what happens when both inflation and unemployment are high. The term was coined in the 1970s when America experienced the same phenomenon. So while there may be some correlation with inflation and unemployment, Keynes' view does not always apply. Economist Thomas Sowell wrote in his article for the Washington Examiner, quote, "Even though there is currently very little inflation, purchases of gold have nevertheless skyrocketed. However, most gold is bought for producing jewelry or for various industrial purposes, more so than an investment. But at times within these past 2 years, most gold has been bought by investors. What that suggests is that increasing numbers of people don't trust the administration's economic policies, especially their huge and growing deficits, which do add up to a record-breaking national debt. More often than not, however, we find inflation doing more harm than good, or so it seems. Thomas Sowell makes an interesting point in his article, suggesting that distrust in currency is natural, whereas in the Keynesian view, distrust in currency can be fixed by fiscal policy. OpenStax' Macroeconomics textbook details the list of fiscal policies that can be enacted in order to control inflation. The Keynesian perspective, which emphasizes short-run policy, has been referred to by some as alarmist. Rather, Keynesian policy hastily enacts policies to correct phenomena that will correct themselves. Fiscal inflation can be dangerous because changing the value of currency can speed up the boom and bust cycle. Instead, economists like Sowell recommend that the government intervene less in the economy. So if inflation isn't necessarily linked with low unemployment, is there anything good that can come of the government injecting money into the economy? Yes. For investors, simply recognizing that the economy is never optimal is the smartest move one can make. Remember, inflation is changing the quantity of money supplied in the economy. Instead of focusing our efforts on controlling a natural force of the economy, inflation, it is more prudent to invest in a recession and harvest benefits during inflation. Rather, a healthy dose of reality is the key to benefiting from inflation. I'm Jack Bittner, and thank you for watching my presentation on inflation.